Imagine the woman you love tells you she's pregnant with your child, but deep down, you feel something's off. What if you find out the truth and that baby isn't yours? How would you react? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, turn on the notifications, and leave a comment below on how you think the story should unfold.
Mark had always been the steady, reliable type. He worked hard, cared deeply for his family, and had built a life he was proud of. He had been with his girlfriend Sarah for 3 years, and their relationship seemed perfect. They had their ups and downs, like any couple, but there was nothing that couldn't be fixed. Or so he thought. One evening, after dinner, Sarah sat him down with a nervous look in her eyes. She had something important to tell him, something that would change everything. As Mark sat across from her, the weight of the moment settled over him. Sarah had never been one to hold things back, so the look in her eyes was enough to make his stomach twist. "I'm pregnant," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with both excitement and uncertainty. Mark's heart stopped. He had always imagined the possibility of becoming a father one day, but now that it was real, it felt different. He could feel the tension in the air, the shift in their relationship. Sarah's eyes were searching his face, waiting for his reaction. At first, Mark was overjoyed. He imagined the future, raising a child with Sarah, building a family. He quickly accepted the news with a smile, telling Sarah he would be there every step of the way. But as the days passed, something started to gnaw at him. Sarah's behavior had changed. She was distant, constantly lost in thought, and avoided physical closeness in ways she never had before. Mark, confused, tried to chalk it up to the hormonal changes that came with pregnancy. But he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. Sarah had always been honest with him, so why did it feel like she was hiding something? Mark's mind began to spiral, and the seed of doubt was planted. Was she keeping something from him? One evening, while Sarah was out with friends, Mark found himself alone in their apartment, pacing back and forth. He thought about their relationship, the trust they shared, and the future they had envisioned. But the more he thought about it, the more he couldn't ignore his growing suspicions. Could she have been with someone else? Was there a chance that the baby wasn't his? He decided to confront her the next day. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to let this eat away at him any longer. The next morning, Mark sat Sarah down, his heart racing in his chest. He tried to keep his voice steady, but the words felt heavy on his tongue. "Sarah, I need to ask you something," he began. "Are you sure the baby is mine?" Sarah's eyes widened in surprise, and her face drained of color. What, what do you mean?" she stammered. Mark's stomach churned. He could see the shock on her face, but there was something else there too. Fear? Guilt? He couldn't tell. I don't know. You've been distant lately, and I can't shake the feeling that something's off. Please, just tell me the truth. Is there something you're not telling me?" Sarah's silence was deafening. For a moment, it seemed like the world had stopped. Mark waited for her to speak, but she only stared at him, her eyes full of tears. Finally, Sarah whispered, "No. The baby. The baby isn't yours, Mark." Her words cut through the air like a knife, leaving Mark speechless. In that moment, everything in his life came crashing down. The woman he loved, the woman he had trusted with his future, had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. His world was spinning, and he couldn't make sense of it. As the truth settled in, Mark's anger began to rise. He didn't know whether to scream, cry, or walk away. His mind was racing, but all he could focus on was one question. Who was the father? The room was silent, the tension thick enough to choke. Mark's mind raced as he stared at Sarah, unable to process the words she had just spoken. The baby wasn't his. He felt as if the ground had been ripped out from beneath him, leaving him suspended in a void. His heart pounded, his breath shallow, as he struggled to make sense of it. Mark's hands balled into fists at his sides, his knuckles white. The anger bubbled up inside him, but there was something deeper, something darker. Betrayal. He had trusted Sarah with everything. They had built a life together, a future, and now it felt like all of that had been a lie. Who is he? Mark's voice came out in a low, strained whisper. It felt like the weight of the question hung in the air between them, a burden he wasn't sure he could bear. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes cast down to the floor, unable to meet his gaze. Her body language was all wrong, closed off, defensive. She had never been like this before. She had always been open with him, or at least he thought she had. Now she was like a stranger sitting across from him. I I didn't mean for it to happen, she began, her voice quivering. It was a mistake. It was just one time, and it shouldn't have happened. But it did, and I never meant to hurt you, Mark. Mark's blood ran cold. His mind immediately flashed to one person, his brother James, the man who had always been there, who had shared everything with Mark, his life, his successes, and now it seemed, his betrayal. Mark could feel the bile rising in his throat, the taste of disgust overwhelming him. James, Mark muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. It was James, wasn't it? Sarah's eyes snapped up to his, the tears already starting to form. She nodded slowly, a single tear slipping down her cheek. I'm so sorry, Mark. I never meant for this to happen. It just happened. The confession hit Mark like a slap to the face. James, his own brother, the person he had trusted the most, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. They had always been close, shared everything, even their darkest secrets. And now James had crossed a line that Mark couldn't even begin to understand. How long? Mark's voice broke, the pain in his chest becoming unbearable. How long has this been going on? How many times? I didn't mean for it to go on this long, Sarah sobbed, her hands wringing together in her lap. It started a year ago, when you and I were going through a rough patch. James was there for me, and I just needed someone. I never wanted it to turn into this. I never wanted to hurt you. I'm so sorry, Mark. The words didn't make sense. They didn't add up. How had it come to this? Mark couldn't understand how Sarah and James had managed to keep such a huge secret from him, how they had both lied to his face day after day. His entire life, his whole reality, was crumbling before his eyes. The woman he had loved, and his brother, the people he trusted the most, had destroyed everything. Mark stood up suddenly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor as he pushed it back. He couldn't sit there anymore, couldn't listen to Sarah's apologies. It was too much. His mind was reeling, the anger building inside him, desperate to find a way to release it. He had to get out of the room, out of the apartment, out of this nightmare. I need space, Sarah, Mark said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. I can't even look at you right now. I need to think. I need time to process this. I don't know what to do. I don't know who you are anymore. Sarah's face crumpled as if she had just been struck, and she reached out a hand, but Mark stepped back, not wanting to be touched, not wanting to feel any more of the betrayal. He grabbed his jacket and stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind him. The cold air hit him as he stepped outside, but it did nothing to numb the ache in his chest. He walked aimlessly, his feet carrying him with no real destination in mind. His thoughts were a jumbled mess of anger, pain, and disbelief. He couldn't believe his brother James had done this to him. And Sarah, she had been his rock, his partner, his everything. How had everything they built been shattered so quickly? The weight of it all felt suffocating. He wanted answers, but he didn't even know where to start. He needed clarity, but the only thing he could feel was the growing anger and hurt that threatened to consume him. As he walked, he couldn't help but wonder how things had gone so wrong. Was this something he could fix? Could he ever trust either of them again? But the deeper question remained. What now? What was he supposed to do with the mess that his life had become?
Mark's mind was a battlefield, torn between fury and heartbreak as he walked aimlessly through the streets. His hands shook, and his chest tightened with every step. The world around him felt like a blur, as if everything he had once known had been stripped away. His brother, James, the one person he had trusted above all others, had crossed a line he couldn't even begin to fathom. And Sarah, the woman he had loved, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. Mark couldn't get the image of them together out of his head, couldn't erase the thought of how they had laughed, talked, and lived their lives together while hiding this dark secret. As Mark walked, he tried to calm his racing thoughts, but nothing could ease the storm raging inside him. He couldn't just let this go, couldn't pretend it didn't happen. He needed answers. He needed to confront James. After hours of wandering, Mark found himself standing outside his brother's apartment. His heart pounded in his chest, his hands clammy with sweat. He had never felt more betrayed in his life. The silence of the night only amplified the anger that had been simmering inside him since Sarah's confession. It wasn't just about the affair. It was the lies. It was the betrayal of trust between family, something that was supposed to be sacred. Mark knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the quiet hallway. His breath came in sharp gasps, and he could feel his body tense as he waited. After what seemed like an eternity, the door finally opened. James stood there, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. "Mark," James whispered, his voice filled with guilt. He seemed caught off guard, and for a moment, Mark thought he might break down in front of him. But that was not the moment for tears. Mark had no interest in hearing his brother apologize. He needed to know the truth. "Don't you mark me," Mark spat, his voice filled with venom. "I want to know why. Why did you do it? Why did you do this to me?" James stepped back, his eyes flickering with pain, but he didn't answer immediately. Mark could see the guilt written all over his face. There was no denying it. His brother had failed him in the worst possible way. "Please, just let me explain," James said, his voice shaky. But Mark wasn't interested in explanations. He didn't want to hear any excuses. He wanted answers, and he wanted them now. "Explain?" Mark shouted, his voice rising with emotion. "How do you explain betraying me with Sarah, the woman I love? How do you explain that, James? I trusted you with my life. You were my brother. And now you've taken everything from me." James seemed to shrink under the weight of Mark's words, his face crumpling with regret. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I never meant to hurt you, Mark. I swear I didn't. It just happened. We were both lost, and Mark couldn't take it anymore. The words didn't matter. The explanations were worthless. His brother had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and no amount of regret or sorrow could change the fact that he had ruined everything. "No," Mark interrupted, his voice sharp. "It's not just a mistake, James. This wasn't just something that happened. You knew what you were doing. You knew how much I loved Sarah, how much I wanted a future with her, and you took that away from me. You destroyed it." James was silent for a moment, his head hanging low in shame. Mark's chest tightened with anger. He had always believed in family above all else, but now everything was in ruins. The man he had once called his brother was now nothing more than a stranger, someone he couldn't even look at without feeling disgust. "I never thought it would go this far," James whispered, his voice full of self-loathing. "I thought I was helping her through a rough time, but then it became something else. And by the time I realized what we were doing, it was too late. I tried to stop, Mark, but I couldn't. I'm so sorry." Mark's anger surged again, but this time it was mixed with an overwhelming sense of betrayal. His brother's words were hollow, empty. There was no way to fix this. There was no way to undo the damage that had been done. "You think sorry changes anything?" Mark's voice was harsh, his eyes blazing with fury. "You think I'm just going to forget this? You've taken everything, James. My trust, my future. You've ruined it all. I can't look at you anymore." James looked like he was about to speak, but Mark cut him off. "I don't want to hear it," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. You're dead to me." Without another word, Mark turned and walked away, leaving James standing there in the doorway, his face a mixture of shame and regret. Mark didn't look back. There was nothing left to say. As Mark walked down the hallway, his mind swirled with the anger and pain he had felt since Sarah's confession. He couldn't change what had happened, and he couldn't undo the betrayal. All he could do now was move forward. But how? How could he rebuild his life after this? The next few days felt like a blur to Mark. His emotions were a chaotic storm: anger, betrayal, sadness, and a deep sense of confusion all mixing together. His life had been turned upside down in a matter of days, and he was left standing in the wreckage, trying to piece together what was left of his world. After his confrontation with James, Mark had distanced himself from both his brother and Sarah. He couldn't bear to be in the same room as either of them. He had given everything to Sarah: his love, his trust, and his commitment. And yet, she had been unfaithful to him with the one person he had trusted the most: his own brother. The betrayal cut deeper than anything Mark had ever experienced, and the wound was raw and bleeding. Days passed in a haze of numbness. Mark's friends reached out to him, trying to offer support, but he couldn't bring himself to talk to anyone. He couldn't find the words to explain what had happened. And even if he could, he didn't know if anyone could truly understand the depth of his pain. He felt alone in a way he had never felt before. He had always been a man who valued loyalty and family above all else. And now both had been torn apart in the most painful way possible. He spent his nights lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of Sarah and James. The images of them together haunted him. He could see their faces, the stolen moments, the lies they had told him. He wondered how they could have lived with themselves, how they could have smiled in his face while betraying him behind his back. How could they both be so cruel? But as much as Mark wanted to focus on his anger, a part of him couldn't stop thinking about Sarah. He had loved her with everything he had, and the idea that she could have done something so devastating still didn't make sense. She was the woman he had dreamed of spending his life with. How could she betray him like that? How could she let this happen? Was it just a mistake, as she claimed, or had there been something more, something he hadn't seen? The doubts kept swirling in his mind, making it impossible for him to find peace. One afternoon, after days of isolation, Mark decided he couldn't avoid Sarah any longer. He had to face the truth, even if it hurt. He needed to hear it from her own lips. He needed to know why she had done it, why she had betrayed him in the worst way possible. He called Sarah and asked her to meet him at a cafe, away from their apartments, where they could talk privately. Mark knew it wouldn't be easy, but he needed closure. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to get them by running away from the situation. When he arrived at the cafe, Sarah was already there, sitting at a table by the window. She looked different, more tired, more fragile. Her eyes were red, and her face was streaked with the remnants of tears. She hadn't been sleeping, Mark could tell. Her appearance mirrored his own feelings: broken, unsure, lost. "Mark," she said softly as he sat down across from her. Her voice trembled, and it broke Mark's heart to hear it. He had never heard her sound like that before. He looked at her with a mix of pain and anger. "Why?" he asked simply, his voice strained. "Why did you do it, Sarah?" Sarah took a deep breath and wiped her eyes, trying to gather herself. "I don't have an excuse, Mark. I can't justify it, but I can tell you the truth. We both changed over time. I don't think either of us really saw it coming. When you and I were going through those tough months, I felt so alone. And then James, he was there for me. He listened to me when I felt like I had no one else. It wasn't supposed to be anything more, I swear." but it just happened. Mark's chest tightened as he listened to her words. She was speaking with such honesty, but it didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. She had known what she was doing. She had been with his brother, his own brother. I loved you, Sarah. I still do, Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this. You've shattered everything we built. I trusted you. You were supposed to be the one I could rely on, the one who would always be there for me. And now, I don't even know who you are anymore. Tears filled Sarah's eyes, and she reached out, but Mark pulled his hand back. He couldn't touch her. He couldn't let her back in. Not after everything. Not after the lies. I'm so sorry, Mark, she said, her voice breaking. I never meant to hurt you. I never meant to destroy what we had. Mark stood up abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. He couldn't stay there any longer. He couldn't hear her apologies anymore. I don't know what to say to you, Sarah. I don't know if there's anything left to say. With that, he turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Sarah behind, her face a mixture of guilt and sorrow. But as Mark walked away, he knew that this was the last time he would ever look back. The trust, the love, everything was gone. He had to move forward, but how? He didn't know the answer, but he couldn't stay stuck in the past. The weeks following Mark's confrontation with Sarah were some of the most difficult of his life. The pain of betrayal weighed heavily on his heart, and he couldn't shake the image of Sarah's tear-streaked face from his mind. He had walked away from her at the cafe, not because he hated her, but because he knew that continuing to engage with her would only prolong the agony. He had to find a way to move on, even if he wasn't sure how. Mark took refuge in his work. He threw himself into his job with a relentless focus, trying to drown out the painful thoughts that constantly threatened to overtake him. His colleagues noticed the change in him. The once jovial, easygoing man now seemed withdrawn, distant, and preoccupied. But Mark didn't care. The distractions of deadlines and meetings were his only escape from the reality that had been his life just a few weeks ago. But even the most demanding work couldn't keep his mind from wandering back to Sarah and James. He'd heard through mutual friends that James was also struggling with the fallout of their actions. James had attempted to reach out, but Mark refused to engage with him. There was nothing left to say. James had destroyed the very foundation of their relationship, and Mark wasn't ready to face him. How could he? How could he ever look at his brother again without feeling a deep sense of betrayal? At night, Mark lay awake in his bed, the emptiness of his apartment closing in on him. The place that used to feel like home now felt like a reminder of everything he had lost. The bed, once shared with Sarah, felt like a ghost. The shared memories haunted him, making sleep elusive. He could still feel her presence in the apartment, even though she was gone. But more than the physical space, it was the loss of his future. The future he had imagined with Sarah, that gripped him the most. He had always envisioned a family with her. They had talked about it, dreamed about it. Now that dream felt impossible, shattered beyond repair. And the worst part? He didn't know who he was without her. He had built so much of his identity around their life together, and now everything was in pieces. The uncertainty about his future consumed him. Would he ever trust anyone again? Could he ever love again? One evening, after another sleepless night, Mark decided to take a walk. He needed to clear his head, to escape the four walls that seemed to be closing in on him. As he wandered through the city streets, the cool night air brushing against his skin, he tried to find some sense of peace. He stopped at a small park, the quiet of the night offering a brief moment of solitude. The soft sound of the wind rustling the leaves in the trees seemed to lull him into a brief state of calm. It was then that he realized something. He was alive. Despite everything that had happened, despite the pain, He was still here. For the first time in weeks, Mark allowed himself a small moment of clarity. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he couldn't let Sarah and James define him. He had a choice. He could stay stuck in the past, consumed by anger and heartbreak, or he could find a way to heal, to rebuild. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was possible. It was a decision only he could make. The next morning, Mark made a call. It was to his old friend, Ethan, who had offered him a much needed escape, a weekend getaway to the mountains. He had been putting it off, telling himself he didn't need it. But now he realized he needed to get away from the city, away from the memories. A few days later, Mark found himself in the quiet of a cabin nestled in the mountains. The silence was a welcome change from the noise of his life. He spent the weekend reflecting, walking through the woods, and slowly coming to terms with what had happened. It was here, in the serenity of nature, that Mark realized something crucial. He had to let go. Holding on to the past was only dragging him down. He had to accept the betrayal, the pain, and then he had to release it. By the time he returned to the city, something had shifted in him. He wasn't completely healed, but he had taken the first steps toward moving on. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, and he knew there would be days when the memories would resurface, threatening to drag him under again. But for the first time in weeks, Mark felt a glimmer of hope. He was capable of healing. He was capable of moving forward. Months passed, and Mark slowly started to rebuild his life. He focused on his career, on his friends, and on rediscovering the passions he had neglected during his relationship with Sarah. He met new people, made new connections, and while he wasn't ready to love again, he realized that he was beginning to trust himself once more. He was no longer defined by the betrayal. He was no longer the man who had been betrayed. He was Mark, a man who had endured, who had faced the darkest parts of his life, and who was now ready to step back into the light. Mark would never forget what had happened. The pain would always be a part of him, but it no longer controlled him. He had the power to choose his future, and he was no longer willing to let the past hold him back. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that in order to move forward, sometimes you have to let go of the people who hurt you and embrace the strength that lies within you. And with that newfound strength, Mark began to build the life he was meant to have.